Hello, everyone, and welcome to this afternoon's webinar, SS7 to IP Migration, a Roadmap, sponsored by TelcoBridges. I'm Mark Marion, Senior Director of Member Services and Engagement here at NTCA, and we're pleased to be joined today by Alan Percy, Chief Marketing Officer with TelcoBridges, and Andrew Ward, owner of Award Consulting. They'll be taking the screen here in just a moment, but before they do, a quick legal disclaimer. NTCA believes that information about products and services should be made available to members so they can make informed decisions for themselves and their companies. As such, NTCA does not endorse, recommend, or make any representations with respect to the products or services being offered, sold, or described. With that, I will turn it over to Alan for the presentation. Alan, thanks so much for joining us today.
Well, thanks for having us. I appreciate it tremendously and appreciate the opportunity to share our story with the NTCA community. So hopefully the share is working okay. And so let's get started with just a couple introductions. I wanted to introduce myself. I'm Alan Percy, the Chief Marketing Officer for TelcoBridges, and thrilled to have you here with us today. Also is with us today is Andrew Ward. He is one of our alliance partners, along with the rest of his team at Award Consultant. And Andrew, I want to thank you so much for joining us today and sharing some of your thoughts.
I'm very happy to be here and looking forward to talking to folks.
Excellent. All right, quick check on what we got on today's agenda. So we would like to start with some perspective, and I think Andrew's got a number of great slides that are very insightful about the way communications has changed over the years, and also then we'll talk about a path to move forward. We'll talk about how SS7 and SIGTRAN are part of that path. And then we'll move back to Andrew a little bit later. We'll talk about some of the real-world examples, some of the things that he's seen in the trenches, per se. And then we've got some time to talk about where to learn more in your questions. So lots to cover. All right. I did want to share just a moment here a little bit about who TelcoBridges is. I know from looking at the pre-registration, we've got some good friends and family on the call, but there's always some new faces. So just real quick, TelcoBridges, we manufacture VoIP media gateways, session border controllers, and signaling gateways for telecom carriers. That's our sole business, our total focus. The company is privately held and, as I noted here, founded in 2002 with roughly about 40 employees on the team. Home office is in Boucherville, Canada, which is just across the river from Montreal. And that's where all the hardware, software development is done. Administration, executives are all there, with the exception, of course, me, who is based in Buffalo, New York. And we have a sales and support team in Hong Kong, Italy, Turkey, Colombia, and Vietnam. And that gives us the ability to do our 24/7 support, having a global team. So that's TelcoBridges. So I'm going to move the slide, Andrew, and if you could just share with us real quick about your Award Consulting.
Absolutely. Hey, everyone. So for those of you who don't know, Award Consulting is a small group of technical consultants. And our history is that several of the team members kind of came out of doing MetaSwitch support, working at MetaSwitch. And so we have a particular expertise in MetaSwitch products, but also VoIP and IP networking for voice in general. And our core goal in working with telcos, typically small ILECs and CLECs, is to be an extension of your operations team, your network engineering, network operations team. So we are working alongside you. We're the escalation point for troubleshooting when you run into a problem you haven't seen before, or if you've got something you're trying to do that is outside of the day-to-day, we can help you with those kind of things. So that's who we are. And I do want to plug at the bottom of this slide, we have an email newsletter, and that's my main job almost, is to produce good content for that, focused on people like you. We try to make it interesting as well. And during this presentation, at any time, if you text the word award to the number 33777, then that will walk you through signing that up. I'll throw up that slide again at the end so you can have a chance to do that. All right, but the reason I'm here today is to tell you a story Alan's got some technical stuff about SIGTRAN later that we'll get to, but I'm going to tell you a story about an innovative technology for the 1800s. I'm hoping that most of the people here today were not around at this time, but I know there are some old folks in the telecoms industry, people who've been around the block, so maybe I'm wrong, but this is probably before all of our time. In the 1800s, there was an innovative piece of infrastructure technology called the railway network. And, oops, excuse me, I jumped a slide there. And the railway network was put together by a group of people called railroad tycoons. So these were the business leaders of the day. And when I hear the word railroad tycoon, for me, that actually takes me back to my childhood. And there was a video game called Railroad Tycoon by the legendary game designer Sid Meier, who went on to create Civilization, which you may also have heard of. And your goal in the game was to connect supply and demand by building a network of railways and trains between farms and people who wanted to eat, or between coal and power stations, that kind of thing. And you were one of these railroad tycoons building out the railroad infrastructure. And perhaps the most famous railroad tycoon is a guy called Cornelius Vanderbilt. And he started life, from a fairly modest place. In 1810, when he was, getting into business and making his way in the world, he borrowed $100 from his mother to get started in his adventures. And it's fair to say he did pretty well, because by the time he died in 1877, he turned that $100 into a fortune of 105 million by building out, investing in railroads. 105 million sounds like quite a lot of money to me, and probably to you, but actually we're not really understanding the true scale of what that is, because if you take inflation into account, and these days, if you've noticed, we absolutely do need to take inflation into account, that 105 million in today's money would be more like $185 billion. Elon Musk, if you are interested, is worth about 250 billion, maybe, depending on the day of the week. So that's a lot of money. An awful lot of money from building out railroads. So I want to bring things back to my home country, England, here a little bit, and show you a map of the railroad infrastructure in England and Wales. And I promise this is going to get to telecoms. You just got to bear with me a little bit. We're going to draw an analogy here. So the thing about railroads is that they are specialist infrastructure maintained at great cost. When I was a kid, we used to laugh a lot at the British railway network because they could never seem to get the trains to run on time, and they would come up with the most ridiculous excuses. And every fall, reliably, they would say the trains are delayed because there were leaves on the line. And we were like, did you not see this coming? Like, what did you expect to happen in the fall in England? And I mean, but on the other hand, if you look at this picture, you can see potentially there can be quite a lot of leaves. And because railroads are specialist infrastructure and the trains are specialist vehicles, you actually need to take care of the infrastructure to make sure that everything runs smoothly. And so today they've actually solved this problem of the leaves on the line with 67 leaf busting trains that apparently they have that go around the country in the fall. And I guess kind of like a snowplow or a leaf plow, they push the leaves all out of the way so the regular trains can go along the lines without hindrance. The point being, specialist infrastructure requires specialist maintenance. It's costly to maintain. The other thing I want you to notice about this map is that each railroad is a point-to-point connection between two stations. Sometimes the stations are chained together, so you can get from London to Edinburgh via various places along the way, but ultimately each station, each pair of stations has a link between those two places, and you can only go between one station and the next. And if you look at the map, there are lots of lines on it, but there are also places you just can't get to on the train. North Wales, you see, or where I grew up in Northumberland, near the Scottish border, there are big spaces with no lines, no trains are going there because of this point-to-point connection. It's specialist infrastructure that only gets you to certain places, and it can only be used by specialist vehicles, the trains. And finally, the last point here is that the railway network, at least in the US, is kind of past its peak. Back in 1916, the railroad usage maxed out, and at that point, it carried almost 100% of interstate traffic. There were not the interstate freeways at the time, and if you wanted to go a long way, you got on a train, and presumably if you didn't, you walked or got on a horse or something like that. Okay, so the metaphor here, hopefully you've seen it coming, is that railroads and TDM networks are quite similar. We've been through the bullets on the left. If we look at TDM networks, we'll see that the same things generally apply. The TDM network is specialist infrastructure. It's costly to maintain, and it is a point-to-point connection between two switches, or SDPs. If you've got SS7 links, you've got the signaling connections. If you've got media, you have those media connections. But either way, you've got a point-to-point connection over specialist transport networks to connect the two switches. And it can only be used by specialist traffic. You can't put any data over the voice network, the PSTN. It's designed for voice traffic only, and we use MF, SS7 signaling, whatever it is, to communicate via that network. And like with the railroads, TDM is also past its peak, perhaps not as long ago as 1916, but certainly we are on the downward trend at this time. So if we go back to the railroads idea, we should ask what happened to the railroads? Why are they past their peak? What replaced them? And the answer, predictably, is roads. So, roads are quite different to railroads. They are open to a variety of vehicles. Anyone in any car or bike or even on foot can use a road. They are easily accessible to everyone, meaning they go everywhere. Like, there is a road to my front door. There aren't roads to literally every place on the map, but if you were to have that, detailed roadmap like we had for the railroads, they would cover a huge proportion of the geography. They're accessible to everyone. They and they go pretty much everywhere. And the same thing is happening as TDM gets replaced by IP. You can see, the IP network extends much more broadly. It extends into my home, into my office. It extends, to the park, over Wi-Fi or wireless. It's prevalent, and it is used by all types of data, not just voice. So you can see there's a big parallel here. But if we think about this metaphor, then we have to ask, what does this mean for SS7? As we're looking at SS7 and the future of SS7, what is going to happen? And you might look at the kind of Netflix Blockbuster analogy and think, okay, well, Netflix came along and it was better than Blockbuster. There used to be a Blockbuster in every town in the country, and now I think I read there's one left in the entire country. And Blockbuster in the space of a couple of decades got totally destroyed. You could think that might happen for SS7, but I actually don't think it will. I think although it is on the decline, I think we're looking at a much more gradual transition than we've had for video with Netflix and Blockbuster. If you're an ILEC listening today, it's not easily possible for you to get rid of SS7. There are various reasons for that, including regulations, including the way that LRNs are handled, including the way billing is done with your carrier compensation. So totally getting rid of SS7 is a hard thing to do, particularly if you're an ILEC. But that doesn't mean that you can't kind of transition. You can't take advantage of some of the benefits that are available from the IP network where possible. And our focus today is on SS7 links and the path that you have forward from here. Do you try to go totally to SIP? Do you stick with what you have today with pure TDM networks, or do you take a kind of middle ground, which is what SIGTRAN represents? Because SIGTRAN is a technology that Alan will tell you about, but it allows SS7 signaling to be transported over the IP network. And the benefit of that is you no longer need to maintain that costly point-to-point infrastructure, the railway link in our metaphor. You're instead keeping the signaling, but using the data network, which is easier to manage. So basically, in our metaphor, that means you're using the roads, the IP network, for SS7 signaling. So keeping the metaphor, that means with SIGTRAN, we're saying that the trains are running on the roads. And I got to this point when I was preparing this presentation, I thought, well, that doesn't work. Like I've broken, I need to start over. You can't have trains running on the roads. But then I realized actually you can. That is a thing. I live not too far from San Francisco, and in San Francisco, the major tourist attraction, one of them, is that you have trains or cable cars running on the roads. So it absolutely can happen. And so that's how I want you to think about SIGTRAN. SIGTRAN is like a cable car. It's the SS7 signaling, the trains, but running on the roads infrastructure, the data network. All right, I'm going to hand over to Alan to give you the meat of the presentation. If you've enjoyed this kind of quirky mix of story and technical content, then I would really encourage you to sign up for our newsletter. I think you'll enjoy it. And I'll come back at the end to give you a couple of examples. But for now, over to Alan.
Okay. Thank you very much. I think it was a great perspective on the story. So I appreciate your sharing that. All right. So one of the things we have to talk about is which path to take, right? And I think the metaphor that was shared earlier kind of gives some description. So to summarize it from our perspective is you have basically three choices. You could just stay with your SS7 links and keep your existing switch and kind of try to pound it out as long as you could. You could start a journey of transition with replacing the SS7 links with SIGTRAN, or frankly, you could go all the way, go cold turkey, transition to SIP, at great disruption and great cost. So for a lot of organizations, they need to figure out where do they fit in this middle path with starting a journey. We think is a great place, and that's what we're talking about today. Is this roadmap going to the second step first before going all the way. All right, little quick primer on SS7 and SIGTRAN. I know many of you probably are pretty versed in it, but some are probably not. So first of all, if you're listening to the recording of this, we have this great video. I'm going to ask you to pause and go over and move over to our YouTube channel, youtube.com/TelcoBridges. And you would find some great background on what is SS7. This is one of our most popular videos on our YouTube channel. I think it's got some 15,000 views, and it gets about another 800 or 900 a week, which is amazing. But it's a good explanation of SS7. For those of you that are with us live here today, you can bookmark that and you can catch it after the event. So a great background. But one of the key things that it does call out is that SS7 is part of a protocol stack family, and if protocols have different layers. On the left-hand side, there's the application transport network data layer and physical layer from the theoretical. SS7 is a stack. This MTP 2 and 3 are critical, and then what SIGTRAN does is the group at the IETF who organized the SIGTRAN recommendations came up with two versions. We'll talk about these variants or versions when we get through some of the use cases, but they have one thing in common, that the transport at the bottom of these two variants is IP-based, and you'll see as we go through some of the use cases the benefits of that as we go along here. So we're going to be talking about MTP3, M2PA, and we're going to be talking about M3UA as we go along, the things that are different between the various variants of SIGTRAN. All right, what are the advantages of SIGTRAN? I think you probably got a pretty strong hint from Andrew's discussion. First of all, now that you're writing on IP networks, you have this built-in redundancy, virtually unlimited bandwidth because of IP. It's far less expensive to deliver IP connections to central office locations or data centers than it is to pull a DS1. And because of IP, now all of a sudden you have tremendous flexibility. You can reconfigure your network. Maybe you had a very rigid network because of the DS1 limitations, and now all of a sudden, because it's IP-based, you can make some tremendous rearrangements. And one of the examples that Andrew's going to talk about at the end is exactly that. All right, so how does this work? And probably the first thing to do is just start with a regular normal link. And what this is here is there's a switch at the left and the SS7 provider at the right. And this is kind of the before picture. If you have connectivity, what's going to happen is the first thing we could do with SIGTRAN is we can replace those TDM networks. So I'm going to click back for a quick second. These are SS7 A-links that are TDM based, and they almost universally come in pairs for redundancy. They come from your SS7 provider and the STPs that they've got and connect into the switch infrastructure inside your network. And again, if you're familiar with SS7, this is all basic stuff. First thing we can do is we can swap that out, and we can use either M3UA as a IP protocol to transport STP the traffic from the STP over to the switch over this M3UA protocol. Now, there's a couple of requirements, right? One of them is that your SS7 provider supports M3UA or M2PA, and that the switch also supports, a matching protocol. And that's probably the most critical thing, is just knowing what your service provider and what your switch can support. But here's a way that you can get rid of those expensive DS1s and SS7 links and move to IP without any additional equipment, but probably going to have to pay an upgrade fee on that switch, and probably going to have to maybe find a different SS7 provider that supports this. So this is with no extra equipment, probably just some software upgrades, and maybe swapping things out with all the benefits of an IP configuration. So the next question sort of comes up is, what if your switch doesn't support SIGTRAN? Or what if some leg in your network doesn't support SIGTRAN natively? What do you do? Well, this is a challenge that we at TelcoBridges took on a while ago in developing our signaling gateway platform. And we offered a couple of different versions, but the most popular is something we call the TSG 800. It's a little 1U package as shown here, and it supports up to 16 T1s, 64 MTP2 links. That's easy for me to say. And can handle a pretty sizable telecom network. And it has a number of interfaces, right? It has, jacks in the back of it and some management interface on the front. So it fits right into a lot of infrastructure very cost effectively without taking up a lot of space or causing a lot of disruption. So let's see it in use in some of the use cases where you would put a signaling gateway to help solve some interconnectivity solutions. So we're going to start with, here's a service provider that has an older switch that does not support either one of the two variants of SIGTRAN. And they've got these existing A-links on the left. And what they're going to do is they're going to put a pair of signaling gateways at the front end of those, put the A-link TDM side towards the switch. And then on the IP side, they're going to interface in with an SS7 that supports M3UA IP over IP. And what's the beauty of this is it's just a drop-in replacement. It's virtually a tunnel from the SS7 network to the switch, delivering those A-links. It's a very simple installation, has the benefits of pretty much a very simple configuration. There isn't a lot of reconfiguration that has to happen. The downside really, though, is there are opportunities to optimize networks once you move to IP, and we're kind of missing those with this solution. But this is very, very popular. Drop this kind of solution in. All right, so what about M2PA? As I said, it's a different variant. It doesn't quite drop in as a transparent interface, but it has the advantage of considerable configuration and management, allowing you to build a more complex network over in the service provider side. So, with some adjustment of point codes and some of the other routing information, you can do a similar configuration that brings those SS7 provider links over to the switch. And the real big benefit of this, of course, you didn't have to upgrade the switch. And I know a lot of people right now are a little concerned about, I don't want to spend any more money on the switch unless I absolutely have to. But you can quickly move to IP in this environment. All right, so what if a little different configuration? What if you're an SS7 provider and your STPs don't support SIGTRAN, and you've got a customer who says, I would like to use the M2PA features of my switch. can you deliver that to me? And this is kind of the reverse, but you can see we put the 2 signaling gateways at the provider and deliver over IP, the SIGTRAN, using M2PA to the switch. Or this could be at a point of demarcation within a service provider where the A-links get terminated, and then it's over IP to the one or more switches within an IP with an IP configuration or IP network for a service provider. So again, more combinations that are possible with this environment. And the one very interesting one that we've run into a number of times is what's called a hybrid SS7 SIGTRAN. This is a service provider who would like to sort of tip their toe into SIGTRAN by moving one of their 2 A-links over to IP. And this has the benefit of, they maintain the redundancy, but they reduce the cost of one of the DS1s. And saving quite a bit of money. So they're going to use in this configuration M2PA to connect from one of the 2 STPs over to a signaling gateway that sitting just before the switch. And based on this, then they could get comfortable, and eventually, if they see the value in this, they could move over to a full IP-based configuration as shown before. So I know there's a lot here to absorb, but as you can see, there's a lot of configurations with a signaling gateway converting from SS7. You can deliver that to A-links on an older switch or an IP-based switch very cost effectively. All right, so a couple conclusions here. We talked about the M2PA or M3UA, right? As I mentioned, the M3UA is kind of a tunnel where the M2PA gives you the opportunity to do some routing and some other functions. And it's really mostly important is, what does your SS7 provider support? They might support one or the other, or maybe none, and you have to make some decisions. But as you start to put together your plan for implementation, we found that there's really basically 4 big steps. One of them is, hardened IP connections, right? You're going to put a lot of very important traffic over this IP connection. So, looking at route diversity, QoS, and latency are all very important things. Generally, these links are done over VPN for obvious reasons, for security. And in many cases, you can run them in parallel, which we showed in that hybrid environment. So, we really think that this is, part of an integration plan wrapped up with, this operations integration. So we think it's a real good move. And so with that, I'm going to turn it back to Andrew, and he's going to share a couple real-world examples, and then we'll wrap up with Q&A and a few other things.
Sure, thanks, Alan. So I just wanted to share a couple of examples from clients that we've worked with who have made the switch to SIGTRAN. Just to put some kind of meat on the bones of what Alan's talked about from a technical point of view. So in the first case, I'm not going to give names here, but just to give the situation. In the first case, we had a client who had actually a few different signaling gateways, each with their own point code, and each with its pair of SS7 links, A-links to the STPs. And the starting point is a very traditional network. Multiple switches, multiple sets of A-links, and they're paying for transport for those circuits all the way to each of their central offices from both of the 2 STP locations. And then the STPs were able to offer SIGTRAN. And so, because of that, they were then able to make this change. And in their case, their switch supported SIGTRAN, so they were able to do it directly from the switch. If your switch doesn't, then you can use an intermediate device like the TSG800 that we talked about to convert your switch's SS7 links into SIGTRAN. And by doing this, you then get to a place where you're using the IP network from each of your switches to the SS7 providers. And this particular client shared with me that this had ended up saving them, I think, tens of thousands of dollars a month in transport costs just by switching to SIGTRAN. So it was a very valuable change for them and really made a difference. The second situation I want to share with is a little bit different. So I'm making sure the slide progresses. There we go. In this case, the starting point is fairly similar. We have a telco who had a network spread over hundreds of miles with multiple media gateways, SS7 links going to each of them. And in that case, the factor that caused them to look at how they were doing things was that they had old transport network internally in their network. So transporting those DS1s across their own network, and that equipment needed to be replaced. So what they decided to do was, even though the STPs still did not support SIGTRAN, they said, what if we can use SIGTRAN internally? And if we do that, then we won't need to replace all of this transport equipment. So they were able to use some TSG 800s to convert the A-links at the interconnection points. So, at their switch, they could do that if their switch needed it, or their switch might support it natively. From the STPs, they were able to convert the A-links from the STPs into SIGTRAN, using the TSG 800, and then use their IP network, which already existed, to transport the traffic across their distributed own internal network. And yeah, the key benefit here is they didn't need to maintain their internal transport net infrastructure. So in this case, that was equipment that didn't need to be upgraded, but also potentially that's circuits that you're transporting across the country that you don't need to maintain. And in both of these scenarios, the end result was a simpler network and cost savings through the switch to SIGTRAN. I'm going to hand back to Alan to finish, but yeah, one more time, I would love to have you on my email list. You know you want to, and it's very simple. Just get out your cell phone. It's an advanced piece of technology, and send the message AWARD to the number 33777. And that's me done. Thank you. Back to Alan.
Very good. Thank you so much for that. So a couple of places to learn some more. We've got quite a bit of information on SS7 on our wiki at docs.telcobridges.com. If you go there and just go to the search box, type SS7, you'll learn all kinds of details about signaling gateways. And also, we've got data on specifically on the TSG 800. You can find that on the telcobridges.com website. Again, probably the best thing to do is just go to the website and search for the TSG 800, and it'll pop right up. And we've got a landing page for to request a consultation. And this would be at www.telcobridges.com/SS7consult. And with that, we can set up a call with one of our SS7 experts. And if you like, we can pull Andrew in. We'd love to have a conversation about your needs and what we can do to help you with your project. Lastly, we've got some great content, a lot of our training materials and how-tos, and of course that other video I had talked about on SS7 is all on our YouTube channel, youtube.com/TelcoBridges, and we always appreciate subscribe there. It helps us build our audience, and we always post our events on the channel, and then that'll help you know when there's new content with the subscription. So lots of good content there, and definitely steer you there. So with that, that brings us to the close of the content, and we're going to leave this up when we start to take a look at some of the Q&A, and we'll get going from there. So I guess let's.
Great. Yeah, well, and I'll say thanks. Yeah, thanks to Alan and Andrew for the presentation. I didn't get to say at the beginning, and apologize to the audience, if you do have questions. I know some of you found the chat box. You can use the Q&A box too, and please feel free to send those in while we have Alan and Andrew here to answer some questions. I'll throw out an easy one first, just so that we get approval to do this. Is it okay for us to post this recording to our website with the slides for people to catch afterward?
Absolutely.
Okay, great. That's just legal liability there. Okay, and I do have I have one question here. What is the advantage of SIGTRAN versus SIP?
Yeah, that's a great question. Like we talked a little bit about a migration. Probably the for a lot of organizations, the leap all the way to SIP is pretty disruptive. And I think, as we mentioned, the SIGTRAN gives you a waypoint at which you can maintain a lot of your, existing vendors and possibly reuse some of your existing equipment without wholesale replacement. But it is a stepping stone towards SIP, and there's no two ways about it. Within another decade or maybe 2 decades, we'll probably see most of the railroad converted over to roads. So I think that's eventually where it's going. It's just a matter of how disruptive is it, and the SIGTRAN method clearly has a cost savings and buys time.
If I can add to that, I think the biggest roadblock to transitioning to SIP today is that for most small ILECs, you're connecting to a tandem operated by one of the RBOCs, a larger company, and those tandems are where you're getting your calls from, right? They're your homing tandem that's delivering your LRN to you and all calls within your number block that is assigned. And in nearly all cases that I've come across, those tandems are still only offering SS7 as an interconnection method. You can't get SIP trunks from AT&T or whoever it might be to deliver your calls. And until they decide to upgrade all of their network, then we're kind of in this world where you need to maintain SS7, certainly as an ILEC.
Yep. No, that's good. And by the way, when time comes to move to SIP, we'd love to help you with our media gateways and our session border controllers. So there's plenty of options out there.
Great, yeah. And this next question, I think this has to do with some of the flexibility that you talked about between the M2PA and the M3UA options. But are there any specific conditions that might cause someone to choose M2PA or M3UA over the other?
Well, probably the largest driving part of the decision would be, what do your vendors support? So you'd probably start with that. For example, if a switch supports M2PA and not M3UA, that kind of makes a decision for you, And then after that, if you have both, then it's a matter of an architectural decision. So I know, Andrew, you got some thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, the fundamental difference is, where in the OSI layer is the difference made. And I actually quite like M2PA because conceptually and from a routing point of view, everything's exactly the same as with a TDM-based SS7, except that the link, the wire, the DSO, becomes an IP link rather than a physical link. And so as I mentioned, I'm coming from a MetaSwitch world. If you're operating a MetaSwitch, that makes it actually very easy to use M2PA as an option because all of your routing configuration for SS7 stays the same, and you just switch out the link to be a SIGTRAN link. Whereas M3UA is kind of a bit of a more structural change in terms of how the communication works. But that's a vendor-specific answer, and it will totally vary depending on what particular equipment you have.
Sure.
Yeah, you've got options. They both work. You just got to figure out the best approach for your particular situation.
And along those lines, sort of vendor specific, and not sure if we can get into this, but a question came in: who are some of the SS7 providers that support SIGTRAN?
Great question. Wish we had a slide with a bunch of logos on it now. But anyways, yeah. So I can tell you one. We've been working very closely with TNS, and they've been helping service providers move over to SIGTRAN using many of the architectures and methods that we've got. Off the top of the head, Andrew, you've got any others off the top of your head you can think of?
Not that I know for sure, no.
Okay. Well, anyway, the best thing to do is probably start with your current SS7 provider, and then after that, then it's, web search to see what you can come up with. But we'd be happy to make an introduction to TNS if that's of interest.
Great. Well, as we come to the close of the session, any final comments to wrap it up?
Oh, well, first I want to thank Mark, your help in putting this together today, and the audience. Always appreciate your attention, and we hope to see you on a future event.
Yep, and same for me. Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Alan, for inviting me to join in on this. It's been fun, and hopefully those listening found it valuable and interesting.
And if they did, they can catch the replay of this on the NTCA website. We'll have that up in the next several days, or if there's someone else in your company or in your network, as it were, to send this out to and share this with, certainly can provide that link to them. So thank you, Alan and Andrew, and thank you to everyone for joining us today for the session.
Very good. Awesome.
Thank you all.
Bye-bye.